I'm Lauren Layfield, and you're listening to Your Next Podcast. This is the podcast that brings you a different series every single week, helping you to find your new favourite show. Today, we're listening to a wonderful show. It's called What's Your Map? This is such an innovative concept that I really wanted to share it with you. So in each episode, an expert in something, anything really, will bring along a map that they work with or that means a lot to them. And historian Jerry Brotton will spend the episode talking to them about what it means and why it's important. Some of these maps are absolutely ancient and tells us all sorts about thousands of years of history. And some of them are brand new. They're made using cutting-edge geological technology to tell us stuff about, like, why wine from Bordeaux tastes so good. What I love about this podcast is that it's a little bit like a tapas experience. Each episode gives you a little taster of some topic that you would have never have looked into on its own. So you learn so much that you would never have learned otherwise. This one is all about mapping the world, but also mapping good versus evil, God versus the devil, life versus death, etc. It's a really wild ride. Enjoy.
You step outside your home, phone in hand. Across the world, billions of others do the same. One person wants to find the hot new restaurant in Nairobi. Another crisscross Mumbai in a tuk-tuk. Someone else wants to trace their run across downtown New York. Every day we live our lives creating new paths, new routes. We have all become the new map makers. I'm Jerry Brotton, a map historian, and welcome to What's Your Map? An Oculi Mundi exploration. In Season 2, we continue to speak to people who live, love and work with maps, making, preserving, interpreting and being inspired by them. In each episode, we ask our guests to unfold a map that is special to them and to tell us the story that lies behind it. To follow the map as we talk about it on this podcast, go to oculi-mundi.com. These days, getting lost is an unfamiliar feeling for most of us, and we have today's guest to thank for that. For almost 2 decades, Ed Parsons was Google's geospatial technologist or geographer. He was responsible for making Google Maps smarter and more accurate for their users. Ed is now Google's open data lead, where he's responsible for maintaining a healthy online ecosystem around the use of open data. Not an easy job, I think we're going to find. But today we've brought him back to his first passion, mapping. So, Ed, welcome to What's Your Map?
Well, thank you very much. It's lovely to be back in the world of maps.
How did you get into maps? Tell me, as a kid, were you fascinated by maps? I love finding out people's answers to this because it can be all kinds of things. What's your story?
I have strong memories of sitting in our living room at home looking at an old AA road atlas of the United Kingdom. And I was particularly fixated on the Scottish Highlands. There was lots of brown on the map. It was 1970s, so everything was brown, it felt like. And in my mind, I was exploring the Highlands, saying this is so different to the world outside my window, which was in Balham in South London.
And in terms of your then subsequent career, what was your training and how did you end up doing what you're doing now?
I was always keen on geography, although not keen enough initially to choose it as an A-level, which I look back and thought, oh my word, what did I nearly do? And after making that decision, I was invited to go on a field trip in South Wales. And I spent a very happy 3 or 4 days during a hot summer, jumping in and out of rivers, making stream measurements, and typing those stream measurements into an old Apple II computer. And that was me hooked. You know, it was about the world around me, jumping in and out of rivers, but also the digital representation of that.
But that's interesting because then you ended up working for the Ordnance Survey, didn't you? So you were really in the heart of traditional mapping, and then you went to the dark side.
I went to the dark side. I went, you know, I worked as an academic for quite a long time. I did find my way to the Ordnance Survey. We literally had downstairs a huge print shop where they were printing paper maps. There is still that that huge value, if you're from the UK, in Ordnance Survey maps. It's part of our national culture. It's something that's there with Kendal mint cake and going for walks on a Sunday. It's part of who we are.
Oh, so the map's still hanging around there, Ed?
I love maps. Don't get me wrong. I've got a big map library at home. When I go walking, I use an Ordnance Survey map. Absolutely.
Today's map is a great piece of royal propaganda. 16th century France, at the height of Europe's religious wars, an embattled Protestant king charges, hacks his way through his Catholic foes, narrowly escaping death. The Christian Knight map is an extraordinary work that was created by Jodocus Hondius in the late 16th century during France's struggle against the Catholic powers of Europe. It is the first map produced on Mercator's projection after the death of its creator, Gerard Mercator. The map was a rallying cry to Protestants in England and across Europe. It shows Africa, Asia, Europe and the Americas, but with North America only showing the land discovered by Christopher Columbus. At the bottom, past the borders of the world, are 6 figures. In their centre is Spiritus, or the Christian Knight. Understood to be a portrait of France's Protestant king, Henry IV, the knight stands firmly on a woman pleading from the ground. This is Caro, or carnal weakness. To his left, Diabolus and Mors, the devil and death, creep towards him. To his right, Sin, or Peccatum, a Medusa-like figure, lashes out at him with a striking serpent. Mundus, or worldly vanity, stands aloof in her flowing robes. Latin biblical verses are peppered around the 5 figures, with one verse asking, "For what shall it profit a man if he shall gain the whole world and lose his own soul?" To view a high-res image of the Christian Knight map, go to oculi-mundi.com. That's oculi-mundi.com.
My map is the Christian Knight map. My interest in this is the fact that it was one of the first maps that make use of the thing that's probably now infamous, the Mercator map projection.
And when we talk about that, we're thinking about the Flemish map maker, Gerard Mercator, who develops this very innovative map projection in 1569. But there's also some other fascinating stuff here. We should just say this is a map by a Dutch Protestant map maker called Jodocus Hondius, and we date it to around 1597. And the top is interesting because we'll see here we've got a Latin title, which, if we translate it, I'll translate it for you.
Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Would roughly be the image of the whole world in which is asserted for the piety of the student, the struggle of the Christian knight. But what else do you see when you look at this, Ed?
Well, for me, in many ways, it's familiar. And part of, I think, our discussion today is going to be about the Mercator projection, how familiar it is to us. If we think about it, most maps are there to tell us a story. This story is the battle between good and evil.
One of our other great friends, Peter Barber, who was the map historian at the British Library, rather brilliantly decoded this map. And what he said is, this seems to be a representation of King Henry IV, who was a French king who converted to Protestantism. But this is a map for Protestants in Europe to celebrate the idea that he was this great Protestant sort of figurehead and that he was going to lead the world into Protestantism. What are you seeing when you look, Ed, at the different continents? Is it looking vaguely recognisable to us?
I think it is. And you're the historian, I'm the geographer. So I concentrate on the map itself. And clearly, we can recognise Africa. The shape of Africa is pretty accurate, actually, compared to some of the previous maps. We have a good idea of South America. The shape of that's reasonably accurate. What's really interesting is the emerging new world of North America. And here Surprisingly, the geography is sort of overextended. It's kind of expanded east to west. It represents, the colonial powers, I guess, in terms of them identifying the bits of geography that they want to be responsible for. And there's this, I think, idea of there's opportunity here. There's new land. It gets more and more vague the further west you go.
So if we look at this bit, Ed, if we look at the northwest corner, the map's not really finished, is it? And it seems similarly sort of over in Southeast Asia down here. There's a sense in which this is an evolving world picture. It hasn't literally, all the blanks have not been filled in.
Exactly. And it's, it's one of those great examples of where there are blanks on the map. Here be dragons almost. We're not quite sure what's going on here. We've got reports coming back, and remember, these maps are produced from written logs, from documents. The cartographer has never visited these places. It's not surveyed in the way that maps are today. So it's an interpretation of some text, an idea that perhaps second, third, fourth hand the cartographer has used.
It shows really interestingly. Well, there's a sort of ship in the Atlantic which is clearly going from England over to Virginia. So this is the early, what we call the Roanoke colony, which is established in 1587, bunch of English men and women who settle. It's the first English settlement in the New World of the Americas. Goes totally wrong. Everybody disappears. It's declared lost by 1590. We have a reference to Columbus on here, and we're starting to see in the Southeast Asia here the very early beginnings of the Dutch voyages here. The East India Company in England is just about to emerge in 1600. So this is a kind of evolving world picture, right?
It is, and I think it raises an interesting element, the factor around the projection that's used here, the Mercator projection. In this age of exploration, maps were, obviously tools to tell a story, but they were tools to navigate by. And actually, one of the strengths of the Mercator projection is that you can use it as a tool to navigate. It keeps angles. So if you want to go off on a particular bearing, this is the map to use. You're not going to get lost.
Yeah, this is one of the first times we've seen it properly being reused by Hondius. You can imagine he's got hold of it because he's in Holland, so he's in roughly the same area. But Mercator's map, the projection hasn't really started to kind of take hold yet, has it? But this is a big moment when it does.
It's a big moment when it does. And fundamentally, we have map projections because we're trying to take a sphere and represent that on a flat sheet of paper. My early days, I was a lecturer. I used to teach a little bit of cartography. I'm not a cartographer by training. The way we always used to sort of talk about this in the first ever lecture on map projections was, you start off by giving all your students an orange and you say, okay, peel this orange and make a square out of the orange peel. And of course, that's impossible to do. There is no way of doing that and maintaining the characteristics that we're interested in, which are about the scale of the map, about shapes being preserved, and crucially for this one, angular measurement. So, I want to be able to use a map for navigation purposes. I need to know that if I go on a particular bearing and I follow that bearing, I'll get to where I expect to be.
Traditionally, before the Mercator projection, if you use a straight line, you're effectively drawing a straight line on a curved surface. So you're going to go off course, right? That's what Mercator does, which is new, these angular bearings.
Yes, it's called a conformal projection. And it's designed, one of its strengths is that preservation of angles. And it means that also shapes are pretty well maintained. The flip side, the thing that you lose is aerial fidelity.
Which is why this map looks like it does. So South America and Africa, India is, if we look at India here,
it's tiny.
It is tiny.
Yeah.
But the further north you go, Greenland is huge.
Many of the criticisms of the Mercator projection today and in the modern world date back to this idea that actually it's a colonial representation of the world. It somehow emphasizes the importance of Europe compared to the rest of the world. And we can't go back into Mercator's mind and say, was that what you were trying to do? Almost certainly in reality, that's not what he was trying to do. Our modern interpretation of it is that it is, representing the world with somehow this Western bias. But that's been very much part of the discussion around this map projection.
Yeah, and I don't buy that. if you look at the centre of the map, we talk about it as centering on Europe. The centre of the map is really on the Atlantic.
Yeah.
If we look at the title of Mercator's 1569 projection, he says it's for use in navigation. He doesn't say it's for use in empire and colonisation. Now, implicitly, that is maybe a European move, but the map is not. It doesn't have Europe as its centre. So when we talk about it as Eurocentric, that's a bit lazy, really.
It is, and I'm a great fan of Mercator. I see him as the scientist cartographer. He approached this in many ways the way that we approach cartography today, which is actually when I build a mapping system on a computer, I'm thinking, who's the user? What are the requirements that particular user has? Let's design a system that's specific for that. So if I'm, designing a system for in-car navigation for heavy goods vehicles, the requirements for that are very different to one if I'm a pedestrian navigating South London. And I think in terms of those user requirements. And I like to think of Mercator having a similar mindset, saying, okay, who are my users? Well, there are these very brave people who are getting in boats, sailing across the Atlantic, and I need to make sure that they get where they want to go.
I think people think that's extraordinary, that a map which is now nearly 500 years old is still, for somebody like you and the work you do at Google, and we're going to talk about that it still somehow resonates. That's kind of extraordinary. And just go into a bit more detail about why that is. What is it about the Mercator projection that can now be driving online mapping applications?
I think it's helpful to go back into the history of online mapping, and that... that only takes us back to probably, from a mass market consumer point of view, the late 1990s. There were a burgeoning of atlases on CD-ROMs, if anyone remembers CD-ROMs. There was a thing called Microsoft Encarta. They used a combination of different map projections, and the world was represented in many different ways. Very rarely were they designed to display the whole world at once. You were much more focused on a particular area. You wanted to get from A to B. The first real popular web mapping system was a thing called MapQuest, which was developed in the States by some traditional cartography companies getting into the original .com boom. It was one of the first companies to be sold on the market for $1 billion.
Maps?
I know. I was working in another software company at the time, and everyone said, "How we've really missed the boat here." But I think the real first major jump in real popularity of the web Mercator projection was the introduction of Google Maps in 2005.
And this is when Google is starting to sort of see the tech here and the opportunity. But why is it, Ed? What is Google seeing about mapping and its application online that other companies aren't? What do they see?
Well, actually, it was a technology shift that made the difference. What it did was to make maps fluid, in that you didn't have to keep waiting while the map refreshed as you navigated around it. And that increase in speed made a huge difference in the usability of online maps. No one was willing to wait a second or two for the map to regenerate. They wanted to be able to explore just by sliding the map around. And to be able to explore by sliding the map around, you need these tiles of mapping. And for the tiles of mapping, you need a conformal map projection so that you don't have to keep recalculating the angles of the information on the map. So that's why we've ended up using the web Mercator projection, because it allows us to store all of this content pre-created. We used to call them baking map tiles. So you go off and you bake a set of tiles, and once they were baked, you didn't have to fiddle with them again.
So move us along a bit in terms of how you're then getting the emergence of Google Earth, and we were all staggered when we saw Google Earth. And of course, the joke was that what's the first thing that you did? You found yourself, which is back to a point you've made before, which is we all tend to put ourselves at the centre of the map. And also then, of course, we went mobile, so it hit our phones. Just explain that sort of history, because I think this is fascinating, because we're going to have to tell this story one day. And actually, as you just said, we're forgetting a lot of it because it's moved so quickly.
You're right, this happened very quickly. So Google Maps 2005, Google Earth comes along 2006, 2007, so a year or so later. The big difference now, remember, is that Google Earth, rather than using cartography, rather than using maps, used what we termed satellite imagery. Now, to be completely open, actually most of the imagery in Google Earth today, and as was the case back then, comes from aerial photography. But it is, in effect, a photograph taken from above our planet of the world looking down. And how that is fundamentally different to cartography is there is no cartographic process at work. You're looking at a picture.
Yeah, it is. But I want to say to you that actually, right back to the Greeks and Ptolemy saying you have to rise up above the earth and look down upon it. So in a way, Google was fulfilling that great fantasy and all these maps.
Up until that point, satellite imagery, aerial photography was incredibly expensive. Very few organizations had the ability to capture anything more than maybe an individual country. You could maybe get North America, might be able to get the UK. The UK, the data was very expensive. Along comes Google with a big checkbook that says, let's just buy imagery for the whole planet. And we'll use Google Earth as a mechanism for creating more content that we'll be able to use down the road. So we use Google Earth as, if you like, a geographical browser that you can use to browse a representation of our planet. And you, as a user, can add the content that's important to you and therefore make that available to other users.
That is
crowdsourcing.
It's wild also because it's the idea that the browser is the world is the browser.
Exactly.
I mean, that's extraordinary. And it's about search. And are we still talking about maps, Ed? Because you and I have talked a bit about this, that I always joke with you saying that you prefer the term, or you used to, geospatial applications. And I used to say it's not as snappy as maps. But are we seeing, not the death of paper maps, but this is a different kind of tech, isn't it?
It is.
And it's movable. Of course, maps can move now online. But have we moved into something else?
I do think we are stretching the definition of a map probably a bit beyond breaking point. And particularly if you think about, the current developments around, augmented reality and the applications that we have running on our mobile phones. We have a very accurate digital twin, which is the latest buzzword, a digital twin of our planet, and that we've got a digital representation of literally everything around us. There are loads and loads of election maps out there now, but actually there isn't really a story that they tell. There aren't really many stories that we can represent geographically on a map and it be useful. So we have to choose. Is a map the best way of communicating the message that we want to portray?
That is a really interesting example because I did want to ask you about politics and mapping. There's a way in which throughout history, and we see it with the Hondius map, it's a form of political mapping. It's a very sectarian map about Protestantism. And we see that right throughout history in most cultures. To what extent is there a way in which maps can still be manipulated online because the sheer scale of data and the reach now of these maps? I mean, you've given us billions of people are now using these maps. And that's, you imagine a map from the 16th century and maybe it's printed in a print run of 1,000.
Yeah.
And, I mean, there's no comparison. So is there a greater danger about the manipulation of online mapping now than ever before as well?
I don't think there's a greater danger. You're absolutely right that, maps have never been more widely used than they are today. Maps are part of our day-to-day lives in a way that they've never been before. And then, of course, I've always argued that every map, in effect, is a lie of one sort or another. You're making a conscious design choice to choose what features of a really complicated world you choose to represent on a map. And, my go-to example of this is always, Harry Beck and the tube map. That throws away the basic geography of London to represent the tube network, and it does so in a very clear and understandable way, but you couldn't use it for lots of other purposes. And that's fine. But I think we do need to recognize the fact that, every map is designed by someone to communicate a particular message. And it's a bit like, understanding the press, understanding content online. We need to know the why as well as the what. Why was this map designed and for what purposes? And that's a kind of level of literacy you could argue that maybe we don't have as much of as we really need.
But this point you're making about how almost by accident online we are now making our own maps. We don't even realize it. Our digital footprint is also creating maps. And I think that's an extraordinary shift again, isn't it? I mean, can you put the sort of tech bones on that idea?
Yeah, and we call maps now self-healing, in that the best map is the map that is most widely used, because it's the usage of the map that keeps the map up to date and accurate. In terms of, our maps today, we want them to represent the world in real time, because we use them increasingly for navigation, exploring the real world. We want to know the map is going to tell us how quickly is it going to take for my car journey, or is the suburban rail line that I'm using running to time. We expect that content to be on the map. That content comes from other users of the map contributing information about their movements, often done, behind the scenes. It's always done anonymously, so it's not recording the movements of me as an individual, but across a population of samples, we can create, real-time information about how the road network is operating, how public transport is operating, and we get that ability to have a sort of a superpower, to be able to look over the hill and see that there's a traffic jam at a road that's 30 miles away, take that into account and have different navigation instructions provided to us. That comes from that circular, virtuous circle of the more users you've got using a map, the more users are contributing to this in real-time view of the world.
Talking to friends saying I was doing this interview, and a couple of friends said, oh, well, can you ask, I was in, South Korea and, there were issues about access. And another friend who said, yeah, in Nigeria, I'm getting a problem here. So again, there are political decisions being made, I guess. And you yourself have said, I came across a great bit in an interview you did in 2022. You said, if you're not on the map and there's no way to represent where you are, do you even exist? ? I thought that was extraordinary. That sense in which if you're not on the map, do you even have an existence?
That's an absolutely serious point now. Despite all of the technology, all the effort, all of the capital that's been invested in, creating, without question, the best maps of the world that have ever been, there are still huge gaps. We were joking about, the Honduras map and there being kind of vague spaces in Western America and in the Far East. We're not quite sure what's there. At one level, we still have those gaps in our maps in terms of, the fundamental infrastructure that we and the rest rely on, particularly things like addresses. If you want stuff delivered to you, you give your address, you give your postcode, and it kind of works the same way wherever you might be in North America, Europe, most parts of the Far East. If you want to participate in the modern online world and get things delivered to you, unless you've got an address, you don't exist. And that's still a fundamental problem. It's one that is relatively easy to solve from a technological point of view. We know how to do this, but it needs, governments to participate and to recognize that this is a fundamental element of civil society, the ability to say, I am here. This is where I live. This is where my business is. This is the land that I own. It's so fundamental, we just forget about it. And we've ignored that for too long.
And you've always been saying, I think, for a long time, Google, you wanted to map everywhere. But I know now you're saying that you've got to cut your cloth accordingly to suit economic capabilities. And you're at the limits there, not you personally, but we are, aren't we, in terms of those online global situations? Because it's also about boundary disputes. How does Google negotiate with nation states and sovereignty when really what that online movement is, whatever we think about the political imperatives, it is by its nature, it's online. It's virtual. It wants to dissolve and transcend those national state boundaries. But when you've got some hard edges, like with Ukraine, Palestine, all these flashpoints, how do you negotiate that? What does Google then do there?
I think, there was probably a naivety that all of us fell into in the early days of mapping online. We thought, the internet was a different place, that we could produce maps that, ignored the complexities of geopolitics. We have, one map projection, one way of representing the world, and that when we hit reality, that broke quite extensively. And today there are numerous versions of Google Maps. You will see a particular version of Google Maps in many different geographies around the world, driven by legal requirements to operate in those countries. The world is just really, really complicated. And my concern is that gets more and more complicated, and it goes beyond maps to all of our experiences online being embedded. And that's almost kind of the anti-globalization now. We're going back to much more sort of sovereign views of the world, which is challenging for any map maker. And I think we just have to learn to navigate through the added complexities today. Maybe yes, we were just probably a bit too naive, and we were never gonna be able to produce the one map that everyone was happy with.
But as you look into your digital crystal ball, Mr. Parsons, thinking maybe about that, the challenges, because as you've been saying, have moved more into open data questions and AI, and it might be that, or just generally, what are we going to be seeing in the next few years? Maybe what are the wins or what are the losses or the challenges? Where's the tech going to take us?
I think, there's a lot of hype around AI at the moment, without question. But I think what AI represents is just the next step in automation. We've always had a lot of automation through the industrial age. Indeed, you could argue the industrial age is all about automation. We're now in a position, because of AI, to automate a whole range of different processes that we didn't do before. And, the most concrete example of that from our discussions is, if you think about, using maps to navigate, using maps to drive in our cars, we've gone from maybe having an atlas in our car to maybe printing out a map from an online website, which we used to do 20 years ago, to having that satellite navigation capability built into our car, where we can follow directions, turn left, turn right, to where we're going to get in the very near future, where the car will drive itself and we're no longer part of the process. We don't need to navigate anymore because the car's doing that on our behalf. And I think that's the next big shift. Maps are not produced for people, maps are produced for machines.
And what will the maps look like? I mean, is there a sense in which what we use when we go online and we look for the nearest Chinese takeaway and we get thrown up a map, is that going to change significantly?
Well, you won't see the map. You'll ask your car, hey, go and pick up a Chinese takeaway for me, and your car will go off and do that, and you'll just be sitting at home.
So the map is going to disappear? I'm just curious about...
Yes, the map is going to disappear. One of my favourite sayings from my very early career is the map of the future is no map. It just disappears. It's there, it's embedded in the system, it's more detailed perhaps than we as humans can interpret. But it's designed for machines. It's designed for machines to navigate the world around them. So that's fundamentally different to what you or I would use. It's less abstract. It's more that digital twin, that representation of the world around us. A lot of different technologies all consolidating on sensing the world around them. Is it a map? Probably, but it's not a map designed for us to use.
Blimey, that's the end of What's Your Map as a podcast. You're not coming back.
You can't deny our robot overlords. A lot more of this is going to be automated, and actually we will all benefit from it.
I'm going to challenge you on that. I'll get you back on the podcast in a few years and see if that's where we are. Ed Parsons, thank you so much for joining me on What's Your Map.
My pleasure.
Thank you so much for listening. I'm Jerry Brotton. This has been an Oculi Mundi exploration. Oculi Mundi is the online home of the Sunderland collection of antique maps and atlases. The producer is Jill Achineku, and it's a Whistledown production.
new episodes of What's Your Map are out on Wednesday. So just search for What's Your Map wherever you're listening right now. And before I go, just a little bit of news. We're taking a bit of a break on Your Next Podcast from next week onwards. In the meantime, you'll always be able to find fresh new podcast recommendations on podcastrex.com. If I were to give you one recommendation, it would be to sign up to the Great British Podcast newsletter on Podcast Rex, so you can find out all about the biggest new releases each Sunday, as well as the big breaking news from podcast land. So that's podcastrex.com for news, reviews and loads more. I'm Lauren Layfield, and I'll see you very soon.